Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, and we're asking the question today: how much more idiotic and stupid does the European Union have to get before it realises the absolute folly of its ways with respect to the Ukraine war? Because there are now reports that, in fact, the Europeans think, in their infinite stupidity, that the war should go on for another year, because by then Russia will be exhausted, apparently its military will collapse, its economy will collapse, and then they'll be able to get far better concessions for the Ukrainians, and therefore they'll be able to save political face in the process. But of course the reality is totally different. And let's just look at what the European politicians still believe to be a reality. They think Russia is a total dictatorship. They think Putin is despised by the people. They think it's the same as it was in the 1970s and 1980s. They think that Putin desires control over Europe once again, so the Soviet Union 2.0. They are economically weak. Their military is weak and disorganized, and as they've said for the last 3 years, nothing has changed. I mean, it's the same statement every single day of every single week of every single year, and they've paid absolutely no attention whatsoever to the last 3 years with respect to the Ukraine war. Namely, Russia has got stronger and stronger economically, financially. Putin's popularity has never been greater, and Russia in the last year has continued to make steady gains, but territory is not the purpose of the war. And actually, unfortunately, from the Ukrainian perspective, they've killed enormous numbers of Ukrainians in these appallingly named meat grinders. Quite what they imagine another year would do to see Russia weakened, and then they'll make these major concessions, beggars belief, because in the same breath, they're trying to convince us all that Russia is going to take all of Ukraine if they're not stopped, and that Eastern Europe, if obviously Ukraine's defeated, will fall into the hands of the Russians. So make your mind up, are they weak or are they strong? And they can't make up their minds because they are so ideologically driven by absolutely ridiculous ideas that, quite frankly, most of them are being brainwashed to believe. And when you start to assess some of the statements that are made, it's irrefutably the case. I mean, Starmer's come out and made statements about a lasting peace in Ukraine. He says, a strong Ukraine that can fight if necessary. Now, they want the war to continue for a year, so apparently Russia will collapse and capitulate, but therefore that implies Ukraine has to fight for another year. Not, well, is Ukraine even remotely capable of doing so, which they're not, and apparently that equates to Ukraine having a strong negotiating position. Well, quite frankly, Ukraine's negotiating position was the strongest it was in April of 2022. It has got weaker and weaker during that time. Apparently, they want to have European support with security guarantees, which Russia has made it quite clearly is not going to happen. There will be no NATO peacekeeping forces. Apparently, Starmer says also there needs to be support from the United States. Well, has he not been paying attention to the big blowout that happened in the Oval Office? Perhaps not. And he says you can't make a deal that's going to fall apart, and that's exactly what Zelensky is worried about. Zelensky's not worried about the deal at all. He doesn't want a deal because he keeps making obstructions regarding things like, I want security guarantees that are totally impossible to implement. I want NATO membership. If he wants a peace deal, then have a peace deal, but don't make excuses why in reality you don't, because he knows if the war ends now, politically, it's over for him. And also, of course, Starmer goes, yes, Trump wants lasting peace in Ukraine. Really? I mean, despite the fact He said it 100 times. We're supposed to, in some way, shape or form, get some greater understanding from Starmer's enlightening comments. Absolutely not. The problem with European politicians, not all of them, Orban's obviously an example of that, and maybe Fico as well, but generally they basically have this contractual arrangement in terms of their office position, meaning they're told what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. And currently they are diametrically opposed to Trump. They are living in a world that no longer exists, but they have no way of believing to the contrary because they don't live in the real world themselves. They live in this atmosphere where it has no basis in what is going on today or tomorrow or next year. The other thing is the European Union are going to have this meeting which will consider the creation of this European defence architecture, spending hundreds of billions of dollars in the process, meaning European nations will continue to crater because they're going to have to pay for it, even though they're bankrupt. So there's going to have to be tax hikes and austerity so we can raise money to blow things up, or say we're going to blow things up, but there's no money available for the European people as their economies crater. They'll be told, of course, by their wonderful leadership that we have to protect you from this evil Russian enemy. Meanwhile, those in Europe who can actually think for themselves will see their sworn enemy meeting with the American officials, rebuilding relationship, and go, hang on a minute, this is a clear and obvious contradiction. But Western leaders will, of course, have to continue to fill their contractual obligations, which is to make noises regarding Ukraine and Russia, regardless of the reality that's unfolding. After all, it's what they signed up for. Notice how they always come out with the same platitudes and statements, and which are basically meaningless. They're just sound bites that some spin doctor somewhere gives them, and they don't make any policy decisions on that basis or have any input into the words they use. They're just told to go out and say certain things. What they haven't realised is that their contract is null and void because that world no longer exists. And whilst they'll continue to be these slaves to the world they believe does exist, because it's the only way to preserve their political careers, they fail to grasp they are sowing the seeds of their own personal political demise. What this will also do increasingly is demonstrate to the masses that democracy doesn't exist, because their governments pursue these inane policies which will continue to destroy their own economies, the financial system, and ultimately societies. They're not going to listen to rational politicians, commentators, and trade and commerce who keep saying this is ridiculous. We cannot continue to try and prosecute a war that Ukraine has long since lost. We have to accept there has to be peace, and we have to have negotiations to end the war, and they have to happen ASAP. And making these excuses, well, there aren't sufficient security guarantees before you've even agreed a peace agreement, is a lame excuse to say we want the war to continue. And therefore, they will press down even harder on the proverbial accelerator pedal as they approach this proverbial brick wall that they're going to hit. Because do they not realise they will need to talk to Russia to end the war? Do they not realise that talking amongst themselves will do nothing to end the war? And if they don't, the war will continue. As Trump said, either you accept a deal or the fight will continue. And therefore, as has been the case for the last 3 years, Russia will take more and more territory, and regrettably, huge amounts of Ukrainians will die unnecessarily. And also because of their ideological brainwashing, they'll destroy their own nations in the process through feckless and reckless fiscal and monetary policy to support a war they can't afford. Never mind the fact they're almost out of weapons, equipment, munitions, and everything else that Ukraine would need to fight a war. and Ukraine is rapidly exhausting the people to fight that war? Do they not actually realise that wars have to be fought with munitions and with people? People they're so readily prepared to sacrifice for their own political futures. And that, frankly, is as bad as it gets. It's abhorrent, it is disgusting, and these people don't have a single bone of humility or humanity in them, because if they really did, they would sit there and ask themselves what is really going on. But they're incapable of doing so. The other problem Europe, including the United Kingdom, failed to comprehend is, what is Washington going to do if their actions were to cause huge global instability? Do they think Washington's going to sit there and go, we'll carry on doing this? Absolutely not. Now, they're NATO members. The United States is not going to go to war with NATO countries. Of course they're not. That would be idiotic. But has Europe forgotten of its total dependence on energy imports, meaning the United States and Russia, or the United States could just decide to suspend all oil and gas sales to them? The list of problems they will experience is endless, including critical resources, uranium, etc., etc. It seems to have forgotten that it was a vassal state of the United States since World War II, and that has consequences. The consequences are you can't go out and start to make unilateral decisions and think you're the new sheriff in town. I've already heard statements that because Starmer organised this conference today with other EU countries, but only the select few. They excluded even the Baltic republics, which I'm sure angered them deeply. But the point is, they now seem to think that Starmer's the new leader of the free world. These are the kind of idiotic statements they come out with. I mean, without actually understanding a word they're saying. They've stolen Trump's mantra about peace through strength. They talk about a just and lasting peace. They're just vacuous words that don't mean anything. Bear in mind, Starmer went to Washington begging Trump not to place tariffs in the UK, begging the US to support security guarantees for Ukraine so their little chihuahua could hide behind the Rottweiler. To coin an analogy, the Rottweiler being the United States. So what does now Starmer do? After the debacle with Zelensky in the Oval Office, he treats him like royalty, promising more money, a loan apparently. Does he really imagine for 1 minute that money's going to be accrued back? Never. It will disappear into the next black hole to be spent who knows where. Despite the fact, of course, in promising all this money, the UK is collapsing economically anyway. Now let's have a photo opportunity with the King, namely Charles. The Queen would never have allowed that. It makes a mockery of the monarchy. Whatever you think of the monarchy, that's not the point. They're supposed to be apolitical, and the Queen always was. And the British people seriously imagine this is true leadership. They think statements coming out in Europe by the likes of Callis going, well, if we don't stand up to Russia, then we can't defeat China. I mean, what kind of statement is that? Why would you possibly make a statement that you want to defeat China when the European Union depends totally on China? Without China, the European Union would be in serious trouble. And what do they imagine Washington might do now as a result of everything that's going on? Do you think Washington's going to sit there and do nothing? What do they actually think might now happen in Ukraine? Do they think, because on the flip side of this, there are reports in the West and an admission that they think Russia's going to launch massive offensives in the spring, which totally contradicts the idea that, if the war goes on for another year, we'll weaken Russia to the point they'll be demoralized, their economy will have collapsed, their financial system will collapse, Putin will be deeply unpopular. It's the same mantra they've come out with since the start of the war, when they claimed they were going to crush Russia. And the biggest problem for people in Western countries, they're quite literally turkeys voting for Christmas. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom and Europe, will seal their own total demise, because they are going to isolate themselves to the point no one will want to deal with them, including the United States, including Russia, potentially even China, although arguably maybe less so. The problem is the United Kingdom and Europe are largely governed by people who are barely capable of stacking supermarket shelves. And even then, frankly, they ought to be heavily supervised. They are not leaders. They are told what to say and when. And no, it's not the World Economic Forum, for goodness sake. That's more illiterate and juvenile propaganda and nonsense. They have no thought or action. And now they think because they're going to defy the United States, not realizing that basically without the United States, the European Union would collapse in the blink of an eye, they think they've been cut loose and they can now make decisions. Decisions based on who exactly? I mean, can you imagine this meeting today in London where they're all sat there going, well, hang on, we're not leaders, we don't make decisions, so what now? And they'll all be turning to each other going, yes, a just and lasting peace, yes. We are going to make Ukraine victorious. Yes, we're going to do whatever it takes to support Ukraine. Whatever it takes includes blowing up your entire country economically, wrecking the future for generations of the people of your nations. This is absolutely preposterous. And they're totally incapable of ever making any decisions. All they're capable of doing is overseeing the total collapse of Europe and then denying they caused it. They'll find any excuse to blame someone else. And it comes back to the point. They told the Americans, we want the war to go on for another year, because the Americans basically asked them, what exactly do you think you're going to do in prolonging this war? When that was their response. And their response means absolutely nothing, because they have no capability to continue prosecuting the war in this proxy capacity, because they have nothing to offer. They're bankrupt. They have no equipment to give the Ukrainians. They have no logistical capability, tactical capability. They don't have leaders who have any capacity whatsoever to make any informed decisions that will be beneficial to the people, to the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian people. All they are is digging a bigger hole by the minute, by the day, to protect their own political careers so they can come out at the end and lie to everyone, including you and I, as to how they stopped Russia, how Ukraine was victorious. And most people in the West will believe this nonsense. So that's all they're concerned about. And if in the process enormous amounts of Ukrainians die, so be it. They don't care. They're not interested. All they're interested is so they can save their political careers, because if they don't have it anymore, then they'll have to be going to work in the local supermarket to stack shelves supervised. And with that, we end this podcast. Thank you very much for listening, for all your ongoing support, which is greatly appreciated. Please like, share, subscribe. We have a very different perspective than most channels. And therefore, what people will assume we're talking about, we're not talking about. And we want to grow the channel so people will continue to be informed and not, sadly as they are, far too much entertained by people who are very good at crafting stories, and that is the limit of their capabilities. And with that, I will say goodbye.